Hi, and welcome to Susan Stanley Stitch in Time and First Stitches tutorial number 3. If you've been joining me, you know that in the first tutorial we built a 4-patch block, and we then took that block and built 12. And out of those 12 in tutorial number 2, we put 3 together to build a row. This week, we're going to put the rows together and start completing our quilt top so we can move on to the next stages. So I look forward to seeing you and having you join me in this next part. For tutorial number 3, where we are going to put our completed rows together to finish off our little quilt top, we will need a pair of shears. You're going to need your thread waxer. Of course, you'll need your thimble. You will need your Bristol paper template. You'll need your pins, your pin paper, and I have taken out about 7 of them and put them into the pin cushion so they're ready to go. You will need your thread, and I have it in the thread papers. That was how thread was made available in stores or wrapped for use in the 1840s. And if you'd rather to use it off the spool, that's what it looks like, and it is 103 cream. And then you will also need your needle. And I've threaded my needle already. This is a crewel number 9. So these are the materials that you'll need. Let me set that aside. So before we get started, you will need your completed rows, and here are the completed rows. Each row has been put together, and I'm just arranging these. I'll pull this out a little bit so you can see all of them in the manner that I think is going to make me happy. I wanted to keep it like the original. I want the pink, the red. I want these diagonals to really pop out. And like I've said before, this is completely your quilt, and you need to arrange it in a manner that's pleasing to you. If you're using your own fabrics, I'm sure you have a lot of creative ideas. So we've got our 4 rows put together, and we're going to take 2 of them and put them to the side. And we're going to take the top row and the second row, and we're going to deal with those right now. It's easier to put the top 2 rows together and then the bottom 2 rows together and then attach those 2 units. It's a lot easier to deal with. So we're dealing with long seams now, and we are going to address a few issues that you may have to deal with as you're putting your long seams together. Everything about the stitching pretty much remains the same. Not a lot of that changes. So we're going to take our top and we're going to fold it over our second row, and we're going to pin across this part. But before we do that, we're going to use our template and really reinforce those folded lines, because those are our stitching lines. So we want to put that right in and butt it right up against the stitching on the side and the bottom. And right now I'm just going to pick this up and do the top, because I, at this point, am going to start dealing with the layers separately to get really crisp folds. So you want to make sure that's nice and secure. That now is your guideline. These fold lines become really crucial because the area within the fold line is what's going to be showing on the top of your quilt. And you want that to be consistent. You would like each of those lines to be consistent. Now, I have talked about this before, that in 1840, prior to pattern making and kind of the Industrial Revolution, when things became uniform, seam allowances on clothing and on quilts and on all kinds of items was not a consistent amount. When we get a pattern today for an article of clothing, it is pretty much standard that you have a 5/8 of an inch seam. When you sew a quilt in this contemporary time period, the seams are pretty much consistently a 1/4 inch. But in 1840, that was not the case. So you will find antique items that have seams. I'm just going to keep going down the row here and get all those folded. You will find seams that range from 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch to 5/8. It's all kind of all over the map. And so I'm not finding that I have to crease these quite as much, because now this is like the 3rd time we've gone over these fabrics. So, and these just tuck right in there because they were sewn right on that crease line, so they fit this template perfectly. Kind of nice. So anyway, that's kind of how things have changed over the years. And you know, that's what you see when you look at these older items, and the reason why you see that is because there was no standard seam allowance. It was whatever you could eke out of the fabric, especially if you were dealing with precious scraps and making do. So, all right, so we'll get that done all the way on this side, and then we'll go that back, and we'll do that on this. And you can do this from the top, because this is exactly the size of your finished seam, and so this can butt right up to that finished seam. And we'll fold it, and you can see some of the seams on this are even bigger. Hand cutting is a little bit different animal, and I kind of did that intentionally because I wanted to illustrate this point. So we'll go all the way across, making sure that crease is nice and evident. So if you're working with children who are doing this, you might want to offer some guidance. At this point, they've been creasing a lot if you're using this method. If you're not using this method and you're using a machine, you know that your cutting has to be exactly accurate, and all of these squares have to be exactly the same size, because you're dealing with the edge of the fabric as your guide to get your seam allowance. We're dealing with the fold of this onto this paper as our seam allowance. So it's just really interesting concept. And you can see even on this block, on this square right here, there's a little bit bigger seam allowance on the top than on the side. It's nice to have fingernails. All right, so we've prepped that. Now we'll take that and fold it back. And now we're going to start pinning. And I like to put a pin in the middle first, because it just orients it a little bit. Put those seam allowances back, and we're going to make sure we pin right in the corner, and we have now stitched line guides to go by. So we've got that right in the stitching on both sides. Push the seams to the side and pin it. And then we're going to pin, because we are dealing with a long seam now, we're going to pin in the corner, right at that X. Make sure it's right at the X on the back. We're going to pin in the middle of the square. We might use all our pins. And that we need to adjust a tiny bit. Let's see, make sure you can see what I'm doing here. Make sure that goes right on that crease. We have another intersection we are going to deal with. And you just want to spend a little time getting this really accurate. It will help so much as you start your stitching to have all your pinning done. Okay, our long seam is pinned all the way across. We still can see our crease lines, and even if they're disappearing, we've put our pin in at the top right where the crease line is, so we know we're going to shoot for that point in our stitching. So next we'll get our thimble, we'll get our needle with the thread, and we'll wax it. You can run this through a couple of times. It depends on if you're having any issues with the thread. I haven't had any issues. I've really enjoyed stitching with this thread. That has been so fun. Okay, guess what? Now, the way you deal with the bulk is you either roll it and kind of curl it up in your hand to get to the point where you're going to start stitching. We're going to go in, and guess what? We're doing the same thing that we've been doing from our very first 2-patch seam. We're going in, making a couple of stitches. We're making a back stitch. We can pull out our pin. And we're going to stitch all the way across. And as you go, you'll let the pins out and you'll be able to release the bulk that's in your hand. Now, let's say we're stitching along, because this is a longer seam. Let's say we're stitching along and we're going to stitch 3 or 4 stitches, and oh, guess what? Let's just pretend that we've run out of thread. Our thread's at the end. We're going to need more thread. We're just going to back stitch just like you would on the end. Back stitch again. Take a couple of stitches in the opposite direction. Cut it off. All right, and then we would prepare another threaded needle, and we would just start again, just like we were at the very beginning of our row. So we're going to stitch all the way across this top row, and we're going to stitch all the way across the second section, the bottom half that we still have here to put together. If you had more pins, you could pin all this and set it aside, but pins were precious and they were not plentiful in 1840. So we're just going to set this aside until our pins become available. And here, let's get stitching. Okay. We have our top 2 rows stitched together and our bottom 2 rows stitched together. I'll turn them this way so you can see both. And now we're going to stitch the top and the bottom together. And this is where, you know, it's a little more cumbersome because you have the whole quilt is going to be put together. So we'll just place them like this. Pin. Make sure you have your fold lines, pin, and stitch. And after you've stitched that together, this would be a good time to clean up some of those stray threads that you left from starting your stitches, your tails. Cut those off, leave about 1/4 inch. Clean up the back. Next time we will look at pressing this. And I'll show you what happens when you press hand piecing. And we will get this prepared for basting. Thank you so much for joining me today on First Stitches tutorial number 3, where we learned how to join the rows together. If you would like to complete those rows and put your doll quilt together, the top of it, I hope you will do that. On our next episode, we're going to take a look at basting a doll quilt and how that might have been done in 1840. We'll have an experience and see how that might differ from the methods used today. And I look forward to seeing you.